Welcome back to Catastrophe Chronicles. I'm Katie Babbick.
And I'm Arin Babbick.
And today, we're going to make a real splash.
Oh, no.
Because we're diving headfirst into one of the deadliest floods in American history, the Johnstown Flood of 1889.
A disaster so massive that calling it a flood almost doesn't do it justice.
Imagine this, a peaceful valley town, home to hardworking families and a thriving steel industry, and a seemingly harmless lake sitting high above them. Then, in a matter of minutes, an entire valley is wiped off the map.
All because of a dam built by millionaires for their private retreat, failing spectacularly after days of heavy rain.
And when I say failing, I mean catastrophically failing. One moment, the South Fork Dam is holding back millions of tons of water, and the next, gone. The lake isn't just spilling over, it's gone, turned into an unstoppable wall of death surging down the valley at nearly 40 miles per hour.
Trees, houses, train cars, whole neighborhoods were ripped from the ground and carried away. People had minutes, seconds to react.
But here's the real kicker. As if being hit by a tsunami in the middle of Pennsylvania wasn't bad enough, the real nightmare wasn't over when the waters settled, because in the heart of the wreckage, the flood started burning.
That's right. A flood that also caught fire.
And the people responsible, the ultra-rich businessmen who owned the dam, they faced exactly zero consequences.
Ah, classic.
So grab your life vest and maybe something strong to drink, because we're about to wade into the chaos, heartbreak, and fury of the Johnstown Flood.
Just another cheerful episode of Catastrophe Chronicles.
Hello, beautiful people. Welcome back to another week of horrible, horrible things.
I'm excited to do another recording with you.
I am excited about this one. This one was, I told Arin before we sat down tonight that I'm going to record for like 3 or 4 hours and he's going to have to sit and listen to all of it. So it's
the horror.
It's probably going to be beefy. We'll see what happens. But I've got a good number of notes, and this is one of my favorite ones I've researched so far for this podcast. It's one that I knew of before this. I knew it was the deadliest flood. I'd done, a little bit of diving into it, but I hadn't really dove deep on it. And the deeper I dove, the more I was like, what the actual fuck?
Whew.
How did I not know? Because if I had known, this would be, this is now up there with like the Galveston hurricane and the Titanic for me. I'm kind of obsessed. So.
Oh.
But before we get to that, we'll talk about some current events. We're recording after that massive tornado outbreak in the Midwest.
Right.
Did you see about that? There's something like, I think there was 3 EF4s. Yeah, there was 3 EF4 tornadoes in that 27.
I saw some of the footage from the aftermath. It's wild.
Awful.
Yeah.
And did you see there was one town in Arkansas that the tornado tore through, and they had another big tornado that tore through in May of 2024? So 2 tornadoes in less than a year wiping out the same street.
It's not a good street. Like, someone doesn't want that street there.
Apparently, it's a Sodom and Gomorrah of streets.
Oh my God.
Sorry, Arkansas. No, it's really terrible. Like that kind of blew my mind, though, that the same street got hit twice in a year, because that's very unusual.
So our hearts go out to everyone in those areas.
Oh, absolutely. And just everyone impacted in general. But it is, if you track disasters, something interesting to look into and look at. And if you can, donate to help out some of the survivors and some of the people going on. I'm very saddened to see how many deaths there were. It's been a while since we've seen that many deaths from a tornado outbreak. And there's supposed to be another one coming up this week. So hopefully it's not nearly as bad. And this is definitely a scorcher of a start for tornado season.
Yeah.
Remember what I said, the Midwest.
Well, 2025 is just throwing down.
We say that every year, though.
It's true.
Feels like every single year is throwing it down. But I think, that's something interesting that I've thought about, lately in general. And I've said it to you before, where I feel like the amount of information we have access to these days, I think really does play into our perception of how terrible things are. Because the more you know to be scared of. And we live in a
That's
world
true.
now where it's like nonstop. And it's a big part of why.
Well, everything's marketed with fear, too.
It is. But I mean, that's always been the case, except now you cannot get away from it. It's not like just in the newspaper that gets delivered. You can't just turn your TV off. So much of how we communicate with each other is on social media.
Yeah.
And social media has become, the town square, and it's right there. It's in your head 24/7. So, yeah, I mean, there are some really awful things going on in the world right now. Don't get me wrong. But there's always awful things going on in the world. We are far more aware of it now than we have been in the past. So, yeah, that's just my personal thoughts on it. And in general, if you're feeling really stressed out and really scared, it's always a good idea to just unfucking plug.
That's what I did.
That's what we both did. We just have not been on social media much.
Well, when we went to Florida.
Oh my God, that was amazing.
It was. I left my phone in the hotel room and I didn't look at it for the entire 8 days. It was glorious.
It was pretty great. Yeah. I kept my phone on me, but that's because I need pictures of the children.
Yes.
And there are a lot of pictures of the children because I can't stop, won't stop. But I definitely did not check social media that often. I let myself check it once or twice a day, like in the morning and in the evening, just because I wanted to be sure if there was going to be another fucking hurricane.
Right, because the last time we were down there.
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, we went to Florida last October, and if you remember Hurricane Milton came rocketing through Florida.
In the middle of our trip.
So we ended up leaving Orlando and going up to South Carolina, where we found out we love Myrtle Beach. But yeah, it was a fun trip. We weren't in any danger at that point. No. It was more of we're going to leave town to make sure there's space for actual evacuees and go somewhere
and they were
going to
shut down the parks. All the stuff was going to be closed for all last 2 days there. So we just packed up a little early.
So I kept an eye on, make sure there's nothing coming to eat us in the natural disaster world. But floods. I couldn't figure out what to make for a drink tonight, so I turned to the trusty Arin Babbick, who has designed our drink. I told him it was a flaming flood. That's all he knows about it. So this is the drink he designed. Can you take it away?
Yeah, I'm calling it Fire River or something like that. So it's kind of a concoction. I kind of mashed a couple of drinks that I found together with what we had. So
cool.
It's a combination of spiced rum, Fireball whiskey for the flame, and blue curacao for the water, and then strawberry lemon soda, and a little bit of...
You took my poppy?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
It's very close. And a little bit of simple syrup to give it a little bit more sweet, because the poppy is not quite as sweet as a normal soda.
Yeah.
So that's what we're drinking.
It's a poppy soda. I love it. I'm into poppy drinks, so no wonder I like it. He did a very good job. It's delicious. So if you want to make one, that's the recipe. And poppy is on sale at Costco right now. Just, right now when I'm recording. So you ready to sit here and listen to me for 17,000 hours?
Yes.
All right, let's go. The quote for this week is from little Gertrude Quinn, a survivor of the flood. I can never forget what I saw. It was like the Day of Judgment I have since seen pictured in books.
Wow.
She was 6 at the time of the disaster.
Whew.
Pretty bananas. So this disaster takes place in 1889, which for those of you who are unaware, that's kind of right in the middle of the Gilded Era. The Carnegies, the Rockefellers, the wealth disparity between the haves and have-nots. The railroads are really kind of at their peak. The steel industry is at its peak. And this plays into a fair bit of what happens in this disaster, as it does with just about everything going on in American history at this point. Yeah. This is set in Pennsylvania, which is kind of like the steel capital of the country at this point, specifically in the Allegheny Mountains, which are just north of Pittsburgh, in a valley in the Allegheny Mountains, the Conemaugh Valley, right?
All right.
So the town specifically that we're talking about, we're going to talk about several, but the biggest of them is Johnstown. Johnstown, like I said, is in the Conemaugh Valley in the Allegheny Mountains. And it was a really quite happy and prosperous area. There was a lot of industry. There was around 30,000 people living in the valley from Jonestown all the way on up. Jonestown was one of several towns in there. There were places like...
Johnstown or Jonestown?
Johnstown. I'm going to keep messing that up. Correct me when I do. Okay. Johnstown. I keep saying Jonestown because I also love cults. I keep saying Johnstown because I also love cults. Anyways, Johnstown, I can do this. But it was only one of several little towns in the valley. There was places like East Conemaugh, Woodvale, Cambria City, and they were all kind of nestled in the hills and valley of, this area. They were all packed closely enough together that for the most part, it didn't make much of a difference. They were all just kind of one right after another. But because of various politics in the area, they had their own, little names and boundary lines going on. Johnstown itself accounted for roughly 10,000 of the 30,000 people that lived in the valley and was obviously the largest of the towns. It was 4 times larger than the next biggest. So that's where the majority of people were located.
Okay.
The entire valley was just crisscrossed with railroad lines. This was one of the main routes in and out of the west. There was a big bridge, and this was kind of pretty much everyone who wanted to go west on the railroad had to go through the Allegheny Mountains and had to go through Conemaugh Valley. So there were rail stations and railroads everywhere. This was definitely one of the biggest industrial centers of Pennsylvania, particularly Johnstown, because there was a huge steelworks mill there, along with several other factories and whatnot. So very much a booming factory town. The majority of the town was people who worked at the Cambria Ironworks. The town itself boasted things like an opera house. It had its own roller rink in 1889, which is pretty cool. The circus came to town every spring, which I just had to throw in there because for a recent episode. There was a grand total of 123 different saloons to choose from in the entire town. Ranging from hole-in-the-wall and, whorehouse brothel saloons, all the way up to the hoity-toity that Carnegie would have been happy to drink at himself. The town itself was founded in 1791. At the very beginning, it was a center of navigation and then a place for shipment of iron and lumber. Busy town, busy state. A journalist in 1885 described the town as new, rough, and busy with the rush of huge mills and factories and the throb of perpetually passing trains. The town itself wasn't very pretty because it was a factory town, even with all the stuff it had, but the countryside around it was absolutely breathtaking. It was a beautiful, beautiful area with these, factories in the middle of it. But as soon as you got out of town by just really a couple of 100 yards, it went from doom and gloom to gorgeous, gorgeous mountain landscape. The town itself, really most of the towns throughout the valley were built on a floodplain between 2 rivers that went, in Johnstown, they went along both sides of the town, but most of the towns throughout the valley had rivers going around them that were all running down through the valley because that's what valleys do. The rivers flooded quite a bit in spring with the snow melt, but other than that, they didn't seem like too much of a problem. Now, at the beginning of the Civil War, Johnstown really started to pop up and going. When the Civil War started, it was a third of the size it was now, and 10 years before that, it was nothing more than a couple little houses and farms in the area, so it had grown relatively quickly. The war and the West opening up led to a boom helped along by the Cambria Iron Company, which was owned by Carnegie, and them opening a giant factory there making steel for rail lines, barbed wire, all this other kind of stuff. The valley was a factory valley, filled with the sounds of factories, trains constantly coming through. Many of the folks who lived in the valley lived in small tenement houses that were built by the company near the factory on low-lying floodplains as well. Flooding was, again, a large issue, both because of how these homes were built, they were not very sturdy, and the fact that they kept digging into where the river was supposed to be. During, summer and winter, the rivers were quite small, and they would build over it, and they would build, little flats up on it and take away more and more river space. And then in spring, everything would flood. Life there, though, was mostly happy. There was a lot of progress. The first telephone center opened in town the same year as the disaster in January. Which was pretty cool.
So they could call and tell someone about it.
So, well, we'll get to that. There were big, happy changes, and it was hard to keep up with all the new inventions that were starting to roll through. And this is not just Johnstown. This is the whole country, but it does apply particularly in Johnstown. Obviously, though, horrible things happened too, like floods, fires, and epidemics. In 1879, a diphtheria epidemic killed 132 of the area's children within a few months, so death was never far away. People died or were maimed in the mills pretty routinely. And like I said, floods were especially common, especially in the spring. Most years had at least knee-high water in the streets, though many involved water as high as the first-story windows.
Oh, good.
1889 had looked pretty good, except for a measles epidemic that was running through the town at the time of the flood.
Oh, so sickness, flood.
So there's also measles.
And fire.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay.
There was also, just on a side note, a random tornado that had hit Pittsburgh that year. and killed 17 people just a couple of months before the disaster.
Okay.
Which I only bring up because we just had, that big.
The tornadoes, yeah.
Interesting that. And another one like that here. At the very top of the valley, about 15 miles up from Johnstown, was the South Fork Dam.
Okay.
The South Fork Dam made the Conemaugh Lake Reservoir, and it had gone through several names over the years. On old maps, it was called the Western Reservoir, which is the name it got when the dam was first built. It was also known as the Old Reservoir or the 3 Mile Reservoir, even though the lake was only 2 miles, not 3. They got real excited and gave it that name. The dam itself was built in 1852, after nearly 15 years of work, and over 400 acres of trees were cleared to build it. So a lot of stuff happened to get there.
Yeah.
It was originally intended to be part of the Pennsylvania Canal System, which is how they were shipping things through the Allegheny Mountains before they had railroads.
Okay.
And it's almost like a Panama Canal type system that they had going, where they would raise the water by blocking off the discharge pipes and then lower the water to get these things through. And it was a pretty insane feat of engineering, the canal system through Pennsylvania. But unfortunately, the railroads really took off within 2 years of the dams being finished for this canal system. So it never really got going and did a lot of shipping, but that's why it was built. Originally, it was 62 feet high and 850 feet across. The construction technique for building it is an earthen dam, which is the same type of dam that has been built for thousands of years. It's the most common type of dam and the most economical. It is essentially very wide at the base and a giant mound of dirt. There is more to it than that. There's a lot of time and, things that go into making sure all of that dirt compacts properly, making sure it's all even, making sure it's all angled correctly.
Yeah.
But effectively, giant mound of dirt put in front of the river. That is essentially what it is. For this dam, when it was originally built, they added spillways on either side to keep the water levels down. And they added drainage pipes that could be opened and closed to, if there was too much water, they could let it out. If they wanted to fill it up more, they could shut them up. It helps maintain the level of the lake where it should be. And these are important because earth dams, they're made of earth. If water starts going over the top of it, they start to erode very, very quickly and can break very, very easily. So this is a way to ensure there's absolutely no chance of water going over the top of the dams. By the time we get to the disaster itself, the dam from the front looked like a huge mound of rubble.
Okay.
By then, it was 72 feet high, more than 900 feet long. Its face was steep and covered with loose rocks, with deep crevices between the rocks where you could find ice even in late May, along with grass, bushes, and saplings. It basically looked natural by the time we get to 1889 instead of what it was originally built as.
Okay.
So that's going great. At the far left, there was a spillway for runoff from the dam and the reservoir. The reservoir was only intended to hold about 40 feet deep originally, but by 1889, it was routinely holding up to 70 feet deep of water and 20 million tons of water behind that earthen dam covering 950 acres. When the water was up in spring, it was roughly 450 feet in elevation above Johnstown, where the stone bridge was. And there was a big stone bridge in the middle of Johnstown.
Okay.
And again, like I said, 15 miles away from town. The dam broke for the first time in 1862 during the Civil War.
So it had already broken.
It had already broken.
Oh, good.
The Allegheny Mountains were hit with a particularly rough spring storm season, and on June 10th, the dam broke. The generally accepted reason for this was local residents had been stealing lead from the pipe joints during the years the dam was abandoned, and this created leaks which turned into a dam break. Super great. It caused little damage, though, because the lake was less than half full, creeks were low, and a watchman had been able to release much of the pressure before the dam actually fully broke all the way. Sometime around here is when the wooden tower that the watchman stood on to watch the lake to make sure it didn't overflow burned to the ground.
Okay. So I'm guessing they didn't build a new one.
Kind of. So this is where enter in, after that first dam break, the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club.
Sounds hoity-toity.
Yeah. The dam, after it had been, figured out that it couldn't be used for the canal system, it was sold and then resold. It passed through a number of different hands, and that's kind of why we see so much of this, breaking down of the dam itself, because it was effectively abandoned. There wasn't a lot of need for it. And a lot of time, the drainage pipes were just straight up left open, so there wasn't even really a use for it at that point.
Okay.
There was the break in 1862, but again, that was pretty mellow because there was still somebody watching it and the lake wasn't that full because they generally didn't keep the drainage pipes closed.
Okay.
They didn't let the lake fill up. But in 1879, a company, the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, bought the land, intending to make one of those hoity-toity like clubs for rich people.
Like a retreat.
They wanted to build up the whole area, build really pretty cottages. This was a time where fishing became really like a gentleman's sport instead of just for poor people, largely because fishing, they figured out you could make a bunch of shit that you could buy and show off how much money you can spend on your fishing gear, show off how cool your boat is in the middle of Pennsylvania. And this company wanted to appeal to those people. And there's quite a few, millionaires in Pittsburgh and in Pennsylvania at this point working for the railroads. So it became a very popular location relatively quickly. And they were very much, catering to that and doing that on purpose. The South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club was founded on the lake the dam had built specifically for this purpose in Cambria County. It was about, like I said, 10 years before the disaster happened. The man who was in charge of setting all of this up was someone named Ruff. And Ruff knew he needed to repair the dam to create a lake for his club that he could stock with fish. He originally had thought he was only going to rebuild it to like 40 feet and change the spillway from 72 feet to 40 feet and make it deeper. And he had these plans that it wasn't going to be as big. It wasn't going to be that, 72 feet that we talked about. It was all going to be a little bit smaller. But he realized that it would be cheaper to just repair the break in the dam and change nothing else. So he went ahead, and when I say repair, I don't mean he hired an engineer to do all of the actual science work to repair the dam. I mean he stuffed stuff in it, like horse manure and dirt and leaves and shit, and filled the dam that way and repaired the break that way.
Oh my God.
Less than a year into rebuilding, all of the new, quote, additions were swept away by a rainstorm on Christmas 1879, and in 1881, more serious damage was done to the dam in a similar storm. They continued through, though, and by the summer of 1881, the club was getting up and going, and people were shopping there. Unfortunately, when the dam was sold to Ruff and the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, the congressman who had owned it at that time decided to take all of the old cast iron from the drainage pipes out and sell it for scrap. And Ruff never did reinstall the drainage pipes. So there are now no drainage pipes on this. It's been repaired with literal fucking horse poop and dirt to make it, but it is holding back water so that rich people can boat.
Right. Never mind the people in the valley. Fuck them.
We don't need them. It's fine. So by the time of its catastrophic failure on May 31st, 1889, which led to the Johnstown Flood, the South Fork Dam was in pretty piss-poor condition.
Sounds like it. Largely
due to neglect and modifications made by the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club.
You could really say that work, that the job on it was pretty horse shit.
It was pretty horse shit. We're going to just one more time, because I think a couple other things they did as well. They failed to repair it properly. It had suffered breaches and deterioration before the purchase, including that collapse in 1862. The club's repairs were shit, not structurally sound.
Literally.
They also lowered the dam wall, kind of unintentionally, but they reduced particularly the middle by a few feet with their repairs because they repaired it up to where it was, but then it sank down. So the center of the dam is just slightly dipped lower than the sides of the dam, which is really what you want, is all of the water being concentrated and flowing over the middle of an earthwork dam when there's a flood. Yep, this is great. They also they blocked the spillway with a grate. And the reason they did that is they didn't want the fish that they were stocking the lake with to go down the rivers into the valley. They wanted to keep all of the fish that they were buying and stocking the lake with.
Because again, fuck the poor people. The
poor people.
They can't have our fish.
And the idea was it's just a grate. Grate will be fine, but obviously a grate, when you start getting debris running through, clogs up really, really quickly and makes it, not great. They also never reinstalled the drainage pipes that were removed when they bought the dam. So we're not cooking with fire. We're sad cooking.
They can't drain the lake if they want to.
They cannot drain the lake if they want to. There's nothing they can do if the lake gets over full. Now, people noticed this. They noticed that the dam was repaired poorly. There was people that went up and were like,
of course,
this is kind of a problem. And they started saying, this is a big deal. This is going to cause a problem. This is going to be a thing. And it really became a boy who cried wolf situation throughout the entire valley. Initially, people were really worried about it, but year after year, the dam didn't break. So they stopped listening to these warnings that the dam is going to break. Because it felt like almost every couple of months, somebody was screaming the dam is going to break and it's going to wipe out the whole valley. And at a certain point, you just stop listening.
So used to it.
Yeah, and it reminded me a lot of this is going to be a little bit of a sidetrack, but it's something that really struck me. It reminded me a lot of COVID, actually. I don't know if you remember pre-COVID, it felt like every single fucking year there was some new disease that I was supposed to be terrified of. There was SARS, there was another flu, there was, Ebola, there was all these things. And there was, health officials coming out and talking about how this was scary. And the first several times I believed it, and then at a certain point I started going, I can't believe it anymore. So when COVID, even though we knew that it was coming up and we heard these things and even seeing Italy shut down and China shut down, it wasn't until fucking Tom Hanks got COVID that I went, oh God, this is going to impact my life. And I feel like this is something we all kind of do. And it's a hard thing to break out of, that when you hear something is scary so many times, you stop listening. Yeah, I don't know what the right answer is or how you break out of that kind of denial. Or take things seriously when you should, but set aside the things that you shouldn't. Because, I don't know. But it's an interesting thought, and it's an interesting thing to think about. And it was just interesting for me to realize, I understand that feeling of boy who cried wolf.
Especially with the news nowadays, how it's all breaking news. Mm-hmm. You need to be scared about this.
Yeah, there's so many examples you can point to. It's just COVID really hit me as the example for my life. Yeah. Because I remember sitting there and even seeing dolphins swim through Venice wasn't enough to shake me out of my
that was wild.
my what's the word I'm looking for?
Your bubble?
My bubble, yeah. So anyway, boy who cried wolf. That's where we're sitting. There were still people that were trying to get it fixed. Cambria Iron Company, the Carnegie Iron Company, owned a ton of the land, owned a ton of the business in the area. They actually offered to repair the dam correctly, pay for all of the repairs, because they knew if the dam broke, it was going to wipe out their shit. So they were like, yo, we'll pay for it. Because they originally tried to, get them to pay for it and argue with them. And after a certain point, they were like, we'll pay for this. We will do this and get it repaired for you. You have to drain the lake for a while, but we will get it repaired. And they were, nope, didn't do it. Wouldn't take them up on it. There were several smaller dams throughout the valley as well. A lot of mills and stuff need a little bit of dam that were going through everything. And the fact that many of them have been destroyed or broken without causing any real damage also helps fuel the attitude of it's going to be totally fine. Dams breaking are not a big deal. Right. We don't need to worry about it. It might break, but even if it does, it won't affect me. It won't be a problem for me. As far back as 1808, dams in the valley had been breaking. There was another break in 1820 during what was called the Pumpkin Floods.
Okay.
Which I bring up just because I love the name Pumpkin Floods.
Yeah.
I couldn't figure out why they were called the Pumpkin Floods, but they were called the Pumpkin Floods. There was another large dam break in 1847 on Stony Creek. In 1875, the Conemaugh rose 2 feet in a single hour.
Ooh.
Overflowing several dams, didn't cause much damage. And in 1889, another dam broke that had been built by Cambria Iron Company as a feeder for the mills, but it was below town, so even though it was 16 feet tall, pretty big dam, it didn't cause any real damage. There were also several more bad floods, almost one a year from 1885 all the way to 1889. That didn't really cause much damage.
So flood, no big deal. We deal with these all the time.
Yeah. The thing was, though, the floods were getting worse and worse every year because of the overcrowding in the valley, and more specifically, the removal of trees throughout the valley. Trees help hold all of the topsoil in place. Mm-hmm. And in forests, having that topsoil there absorbs a lot of the water. And in a valley, you need that ecosystem. You need the trees holding the topsoil when the snow melt runs off in spring to keep it from becoming a huge flash flooding situation. And they were, as the town was booming and growing, taking down more and more of these trees, which meant there was more and more floodwaters coming down off the mountain that weren't being absorbed.
Right, because all the topsoil gets washed away, right?
all of the everything gets washed away. When you don't have the trees to hold the topsoil in place, you don't have that topsoil to suck in the water because it's gotten washed away. So there's more debris, there's more flood water, there's literally more water coming down the mountain into the valley. And they are building into these riverbeds more and more. So there's less and less river available to carry this water out of the valley and more water going into the valley itself. So it's becoming this like self-perpetuating problem without even talking about a dam break of flooding, and the floods are getting worse and worse. By 1885, Stony Creek actually rose 3 feet in 45 minutes at one point.
That's a lot.
So they're getting more and more destructive, but they hadn't caused many deaths, and the damages they'd caused had not been, truly catastrophic for a variety of reasons, not the least of which, today, when a flood goes through a home, you usually have to rebuild the entire home.
Yeah.
They didn't really do that then, for better or worse.
So just
flood-damaged
homes that you're living in.
It's fine. The whole town was basically flood-damaged at this point. So Victor Heiser, a survivor of the flood, said years later, the townspeople, like those who live in the shadow of Vesuvius, grew callous to the possibility of danger. Sometime, they thought, that dam will give way, but it won't happen to me. So that's where we're sitting.
Yep.
It's very comforting.
Won't happen to me.
That's what we always think, right?
Yep.
That's what we always think. And I'm going to do another plug for the book I read, The Unthinkable. I fucking love that book.
I heard a snippet of it the other day when you were listening to it.
I re-listened to it again because it was just such a good book and I wanted to hear it again.
From what I heard, it was fantastic.
You should absolutely listen to it. Everyone should listen to it. Hold on. It's by Amanda Ripley, and The Psychology of Disaster. I thoroughly enjoyed the perspective that she gave on everything. But anyway, my point here is denial is the first stage of any disaster. And denial is not just after the disaster happens, but it's also before the disaster, and not realizing it can in fact happen to you and making preparations so that you will be safe if and when it does happen.
Yeah.
And we're very much in that case here with the entire valley, that they're just in denial. They don't think it'll happen to them, and if it does, it won't be that big of a deal. So no one is really well prepared. No one really has a good plan. No one is really thinking about this beyond like, it's fine. No biggie.
It's a great setup.
So here we are. It's May 1889. The U.S. Signal Service put out warnings to all of the mid-Atlantic states that they should expect severe weather on May 30th, 1889, and for the days beyond. And in fact, they did end up seeing the worst downpour that section of the country had ever seen, starting on May 30th. The
More
most
water.
rain since white people had settled the area. May 30th was Memorial Day that year. The town had a huge parade and was decked out in flags, especially at the ceremony, because this is not that long after the end of the Civil War.
Okay.
So there are quite a few military members that needed to be commemorated on Memorial Day, because let's remember, this is my little soapbox that Arin knows and Arin believes into. Memorial Day is not a happy day. No. It's a sad day. This is the day that we thank the men and women who gave their lives to our country to keep us free and safe and happy. And this was Memorial Day after the Civil War. So I would imagine all the Memorial Days in this particular time period were even more poignant because it was the Civil War. And it's, I just can't imagine how hard that would be in that time period. But this is where we are. The town was hopping. Hotels were full. There was tons of people there with Civil War casualties. It was only about 30 years since Lincoln had first called for volunteers. There's a lot of people.
Yeah.
Big parade. All this stuff. The rain started about 4 p.m. that day, and while it started quite gentle and light, it quickly picked up speed and intensity through the night, and there had already been more than 100 days of rain by that point in the year. It is only the end of May. The soil is saturated. Overnight, like I said, the worst rain they had seen in that area of the country ever. One small creek, Otto Run, which was one of the feeders into the reservoir behind the South Fork Dam, was 4 feet deep by that morning. Its usual depth was 2 inches.
Oh, wow.
That is how much rain was falling. It was nuts. Overnight, folks also reported hearing loud, thunderous crashes. Many thought that last days were coming because there was so much, it wasn't thunder, it was just loud booms echoing through the valley.
Whoa.
In the morning and over the next few days, though, it was realized that these booms were mudslides, With no trees to keep the topsoil in place and lots of rain, there was a number of mudslides before the main flood even happens that wiped out a couple of different farmhouses and homes just throughout the valley because there were not enough trees to keep that topsoil in place. Every creek was a river. Every spring was rampaging. The earth, quite simply, could not hold any more water at this point.
Damn.
Damn. So that brings us
I didn't mean the pun, but it's a good one.
That brings us to the morning of May 31st. When the sun first rose that morning, there was actually a bit of let up in the rain. It didn't stop, but it wasn't quite as much of a deluge as it was overnight. And folks mostly started to go through their day as normal throughout Johnstown and the rest of the valley. The night before, like I said, had portended some danger if folks had really thought to look for it. One of those landslides had completely caved in a stable at a brewery. The rivers were up and roaring, rising at more than 1 foot an hour, and they were a gross yellow-brown color with quite a bit of logs and lumber starting to fill them already as debris were being filtered through the valley as all of these different landslides and, floods were happening. John Park woke up at around 6:30 in the morning. He worked for the South Fork Club, and one of his jobs, he was one of the maintenance guys for the area.
All right.
So he went quickly to go check on the lake after the brutal rains the night before and quickly saw that it had risen about 2 feet and all of its feeders were flowing into it at an absolutely alarming pace. He could hear the water coming in more than he could see it through the gloom of the morning. When he went to look closer, he found much of the edges of the lake were covered in debris coming in from all of the feeders, which were already blocking much of the spillway. By his account, the lake was rising at this point about an inch every 10 minutes, and at that rate, it would begin to spill over the top of the dam in a matter of hours.
Well, fuck.
I'm just going to reiterate, earthwork dams never can have water spilling over the top of them.
Right.
Because of their construction, when water starts to go over the top of an earthwork dam, it can very quickly cut through it and completely dissolve it because water is eroding. And as long as you can keep it below the top, earthwork dams are great. They work very, very well.
Right, because it's not being washed away little bit by little bit.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't even go little by little bit. When it starts going over the top, it really can be a matter of moments once water starts going over the top of an earthwork dam.
Right.
Especially a poorly constructed one.
It's expanding surface area.
Exactly right. And so it's not good. So he's looking at it going, this is probably going to...
It's going to fail.
Well, he wasn't saying fail yet, but yeah.
He's not good.
It's going to breach the dam in a couple of hours. At the dam itself, he gathered a number of folks to try and start digging out the spillway of debris to allow water to flow out of the reservoir more quickly and hopefully avoid that spillover. It wasn't going well, though. And again, there's no overflow pipes. There's nothing to open to let the water out anymore. At the center of the dam, by 7 o'clock that morning, water was only 2 feet away from the top.
Yeah, it's not good.
And the rain is not started getting bad again yet.
Oh, and it's getting worse.
The rain started to get really bad again around 7:30 that morning. Folks working at the mills were sent home to look after their families. By 10 o'clock, most cellars had a good foot of water inside of them, and schools were let out with children sent home because the flooding was starting to get so bad with the rain picking up. By late morning, early afternoon, town folks were out and about helping neighbors evacuate the lowest parts of town that were already more flooded than they ever had been before. The mood wasn't dire. While this was definitely worse than normal, it was within the realm of what they had experienced before. So they were getting the people in the lowest areas out, along with livestock being moved to higher ground just in case. Folks started to move their belongings into their second and third stories and settling in to wait out the floods. Hundreds of families moved out, wading through the streets with huge bundles of belongings, retreating to higher terrain, or with cobbled-together rafts floating their way out of the villages. Some of these people went to the tall hotels in the center of town, thinking to take a room on a higher floor, and that would be a safe place to go. The water, by early afternoon, was anywhere from 2 to 10 feet deep throughout Johnstown, already higher than the 87 flood, and even before things go sideways, the worst flood that Johnstown had ever experienced.
I mean, 10 feet that's a lot.
That's a lot of water. That's one story in some parts of town.
Yeah.
That's a lot of water. Not long after 11, bigger logs were starting to rocket through the 2 creeks that were now rivers, starting to take things out and jamming into the stone bridge between the arches. So I don't think I mentioned enough the bridge. In Johnstown, there's a giant bridge that's right through like the last third of the town.
Okay.
This bridge is enormous, and it is the bridge that the majority of trains have to go over to either go west if they're going that way or to come back east.
Okay.
It is one of the biggest railway bridges in the country at this point.
And I'm guessing it goes over both of the rivers.
Well, by the time you get there, there's two rivers that go around Johnstown, and then they come together into the Conemaugh River, and the bridge goes over the Conemaugh River.
Okay.
Through the gap, and it's a narrow point, like it's a narrow chokehold.
Yeah.
And by doing it that way, they were able to do a shorter bridge, but it's very tall and just a huge engineering marvel.
These logs are starting to clog the river's passage underneath the bridge.
Underneath the bridge and in other parts of town. There's enough of them coming in that they're starting to be clogs throughout the rivers and at the bridges through the town, which is just kind of bananas at this point. We're not even, it's not bad yet, guys. We're not at the disaster yet. And we've got 10 feet deep of water and logs crashing into buildings.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's great. Trains started being stranded out in the valley as portions of the railroad tracks were washed out and washed away.
Oh.
Among these was a mail train and a section of the Day Express, which was made up of 7 different cars and had around 90 passengers plus crew. By 11, the water at the dam was even with the center top of the dam. And it was very close to spilling over. And on the outer face of the dam, near the base of the dam, several leaks had formed as well. They were described by contemporaries as looking like a flower pot pouring water.
Yeah, that's not good.
Yeah, it's not great. Leading men at the dam to think perhaps they should start warning folks below in the water's path. So this is when we start having people going down.
Only now warning people?
Only now warning people. Sometime between noon and 1, a telegraph came down to East Conemaugh. Later, no one would recall exactly what it said, but it was something along the lines of the South Fork Dam is likely to break and to notify the folks of Johnstown to prepare to get out and anyone else in the valley. This telegram was set aside and forgotten about immediately. These kinds of warnings were common and not worth worrying about, apparently.
Oh.
Getting full telegraphs out quickly became a challenge after this point because telegraph wires started to fall into the now raging rivers.
Awesome.
A line of telephone, essentially, was set up running from working telegram stations. So, like, the telegram station in South Fork wasn't working, so people from the dam would run to East Conemaugh to send out the telegram because they couldn't do it from South Fork because the South Fork telegram wires were down. So like this game of running telephone because they couldn't just send it over the lines like you normally would.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that slows things down a lot.
Now, at this same time, John Park, the one who had originally checked the dam, starts riding down into South Fork, despite the terrible road conditions, because most of the roads are washed out at this point, to warn people on foot, kind of like a modern, well, not modern, a Civil War Paul Revere.
Yeah.
The floods are coming, the floods are coming. And of course, like, no one listens to him. Everyone just assumes that he's full of shit, and basically no one who hasn't already left, because a lot of people have left because the flooding was already happening from the rains. But anyone who hadn't left didn't leave because John Park went. But he did try, which is something. There were a total of 3 telegraph warnings that were sent into the valley over the course of the day, each getting progressively more dire as the dam looked worse and worse. Every single one of them was pretty much completely ignored. By 2, water was actively running over the top of the dam and the rain hadn't let up at all. At 2:30, a notch had formed at the center top of the dam from water pouring over. In the valley and Johnstown, by 3 p.m., most people were where they planned to wait out the storm. Those who could leave had, those who couldn't or didn't want to were holed up and waiting. At some point during this, like before the dam broke, Stony Creek, I just thought this description was crazy, carried a live cow down, and the cow struck one of the downed bridges that had been washed out, where she managed to almost get out before falling and being carried off again. So, like, again, the dam has not broke, and there's fucking cows being carried down the river. Like, this is not good. South Fork Dam was barely holding back a body of water 3 miles long, a mile wide, and 60 feet deep at the top of the valley, weighing 20 million tons.
It's just a little bit of water.
A little bit of water. At this point, rocks are starting to fall off the face of the dam. The small notch had become a torrent and was getting larger with each passing minute. The first break was large enough to admit the passage of a train. We went from a notch to locomotive size break at the top of the dam. It flowed like that for just a few minutes, and then the water just cut through the dam like a knife through cake, and the entire thing collapsed all at once at about 3:10 in the afternoon. 1 minute the dam was there, the next it wasn't, and all of that collected water moved down into the valley at once.
Oof.
Colonel Unger was there at the dam when it broke, and he said, "It seemed to me as if all the destructive elements of the Creator had been turned loose at once in that awful current of water."
Ooh.
It leapt into the valley almost like a living thing, roaring and taking everything in its path. Behind it, everything was swept clean as if someone had taken a spatula through the valley itself. No trees, no homes, no grass, barely even topsoil. All of that was now in the mass of water as it moved, gathering more and more debris each moment. Giant chunks of the dam, fence posts, logs, boulders, entire trees, and homes went with it. It took between 30 and 40 minutes for the entire lake to flow out into the valley.
God.
It was flowing at about the same rate that Niagara Falls does. So to just picture what this was, imagine if somebody turned Niagara Falls on in a narrow valley and left it on for 40 minutes. Your tap is Niagara Falls.
Yeah.
And just on for 30 to 40 minutes. And that's how far the water behind it is. That's how long the flood is. This is catastrophic.
Yeah.
Catastrophic. George Lamb's house was the first house destroyed, but not the last. George barely escaped. He tried to save his 2 pigs when he saw the flood coming, but gave up once he realized he couldn't and barely made it to high ground in time. He watched as his house climbed the 60-foot-tall wave of water as it swept by and then get tossed into the hillside, smashing into splinters.
Damn.
Right about where Lamb's house was, Right about where Lamb's house was, the valley takes a sharp turn. Those who had been by the dam and watched it break were able to see where it turned, but not able to see what it did beyond that point. All they had was their imagination. And I picture them standing there and seeing it all flow and go around that corner, and how horrifying that must be. I feel like that's almost worse to have your imagination sitting and thinking, especially because so many of the people at the dam were people who worked for the club. And I mean, I hope they feel a little responsible. It wasn't entirely their fault, but I feel like anyone who worked for the club should feel a little responsible. Shortly past where the South Fork Dam was the South Fork town. And in that town, there was a train, the Chicago Limited, that had been stopped due to all the issues with the tracks and was waiting to be cleared to leave. The conductor was getting nervous about the dam and about being directly in the path of it, especially after he heard John Park come down. Yeah. So he made the choice to try and slowly creep the train out of town, even without permission, shortly before 3:00. So he's already got the train moving when the dam breaks.
Okay.
Right after the dam broke, or shortly after, people started running through the streets shouting that the dam had in fact broken and all the water was coming this way. And then he and other folks in town who hadn't seen it saw it coming around that corner, a mountain of water, the entire width of the valley coming directly at them.
Oh.
Some of the folks at the train station ran to the top of the coal tipple that was right there, hoping it would be tall enough to escape the water. Others jumped onto the train and slammed it into full gear. Safe ground was only a few hundred yards away, but they had to go over a bridge that was already kind of precarious and being washed out by the river. But by now, the water wall was moving at a rate of 10 to 15 miles per hour and driving before it a mass of debris that included acres of trees, bridges, houses, dead animals, and all kinds of rubbish. About 200 yards before that bridge that the train was rushing over to get out of the way, the flood took its very first life. Michael Mann. He was a coal miner and a preacher, and he had ignored all the warnings and stayed in his shanty on the river that he had lived in South Fork Creek. His body was found a week later, a mile and a half downstream, half buried in the mud and stripped of all clothing. It was so badly decomposed by the time it was found that he had to be buried where he was found. Okay. He's now known as the flood's first victim because he's where his home was. It's the first place we know that the dam break took a life. The locomotive itself escaped just in time and basically untouched. That is, until a tree was knocked over in the flood and landed on the train, knocking it off the tracks onto its side. But they did make it out of the way of the flood, and no one was injured on the train itself.
Huh. Okay.
Pretty incredible. Most of South Fork was on the hillsides, thankfully, so most of the town itself was spared, and it only suffered a total of 4 deaths. The first victim, Michael Mann, and 3 others. The flood wasn't done yet, though. It had a whole valley to fuck up. The planing mill, around 20 homes, the train depot, and a large part of another train were destroyed along with a few odds and ends in South Fork, including the bridge in town, which the train went over in the torrents of water, and the bridge itself was tossed 20 yards the opposite direction of the flood going because of the eddies and currents in the water. And this is something we're going to run into with this flood a lot, with all of the curves and different things. It's not a straight current. There's a lot of back and forth and washing in it, a lot of whirlpools because it's hitting edges, it's hitting mountains, it's taking a lot of turns. It's not just a straight flow the way you would think because it is so big. The first mile past South Fork, the valley had basically nothing but railroad tracks in it. Those were, obviously, wiped out, tearing the ties to twisted steel shards and swallowing any equipment. After that, though, the valley itself narrows quite dramatically. So this compacted the water that had now sped up from going through this blank area into a wall that was now 70 to 75 feet tall, moving at about 40 miles an hour. Yep. A little further down the valley, about a half mile more, the valley turns again, and at that point, there's a giant stone viaduct that had been built more than 50 years before. The viaduct was absolutely enormous and another landmark of the valley. It was 75 feet high and bridged a river gap with one giant 80-foot arch. Even trains looked small as they chugged across this. When the flood hit this viaduct, some of the water started going over, but much of the debris caught on top of the bridge or in its huge arc, gathering now 2 miles worth of shredded materials and bodies. 6 to 7 minutes passed as the bridge held, essentially forming another reservoir for a moment as the water came down the mountain, putting more and more pressure on the clogged bridge, before some of it started to kind of spurt over the bridge, but most of it was stuck. It was basically another dam, forming a watertight system. But it failed. It didn't stop there. And when this impromptu dam let go, it let go even more suddenly and violently than the first one did. The bridge collapsed all at once, and all of that collected water exploded again into the valley with maximum power concentrated again thanks to the delay. So now it's moving even faster with even more debris and huge chunks, and it's getting worse and worse as we go further and further along. A mile past that bridge, the viaduct, was a white frame village called Mineral Point, consisting of about 30 homes on a single street. It was a quiet little town tucked away in the mountains on a shallow river that ran right through the middle of town.
It's not so shallow anymore. It's about to not be.
There were about 200 people who lived in town, if you counted the outlying families that picked up their mail there. There was a sawmill, a general store, and a tower for the railroad, and not much else. Thankfully, the people of Mineral Point had mostly left the day and night before because of the flooding happening, because they're all on the river. So there weren't as many deaths as there could have been in this town. The entire town was completely wiped out, though. Again, like a spatula going through it. The town was completely razed. It was hard to tell there had even been a Mineral Point, much less that it had been destroyed. It was wiped completely clean to the bedrock.
Fuck.
The number of deaths came to 16 for Mineral Point. Quite a few people managed to survive by essentially surfing on their own rooftops till they got close enough to the side to jump off. Christopher Gromley and his son traveled 4 miles downriver this way before they were able to leap safely to shore. Once they made it back to Mineral Point, however, they found that Mrs. Gromley and 6 other children had died in their home. The flood continued down the valley, picking up speed where there were no turns and slowing down where there were. Scientists estimate that its peak speed would have been 40 miles per hour.
Jesus.
Again. To make it scarier, its rate of advance would have been quite fitful. Witnesses later said that it would come to a brief standstill as things got caught in narrower parts of the valley before ripping free again. And when it would rip free again, it would almost look like dynamite had gone off, with trees and debris just shooting off into the air once it ripped free and went forward. Or parts of it would stop before ripping free and then speed up. When it would stop momentarily, it was chaos. Logs and other pieces of debris were also being tossed on top through the course of this, being thrown into the air, not just in the flood itself.
That's wild.
Bananas. The friction of the terrain and debris at the bottom also meant that the bottom, and this happens with a lot of flash floods like this, moved slower than the water on top. So it was essentially moving like a giant, perpetually cresting wave with a violent downward motion. So things that were caught up in it were being slammed into the ground in front of it. One of the biggest problems later would be digging up bodies that had been pounded deep into the mud by this downward momentum of the flood that was being caused by that bottom part being slowed down by friction and the top part not having to deal with that friction. Work train number 2 was in the valley, being run by a man named Hess, working at trying to clean up some of the washouts of tracks to open up more lanes that day. They had been slowly working on a washout so they could try and repair it when they heard, not saw, the flood coming like a hurricane through the wooded area. Once they could see the tops of trees bending and falling apart, they knew that the flood was coming right at them, and this was not good. They pretty much knew immediately, the reservoir broke. We need to get the hell out of here.
Yeah.
Some of the men who had been outside working ran up the hill. Others jumped on the train, and the train took off like a bat out of hell with a whistle blaring nonstop, shrieking as fast as they could, steaming towards East Conemaugh and the railroad yards where other trains were waiting and were above where the flood level would be.
Okay.
They made it just in time.
Whew.
Basically with the water on their butts, just ricocheting through. The Hess ride into Conemaugh is one of the most famous stories of the time because it's such an interesting, the train running from the flood and making it just barely in the nick of time.
So cinematic.
Danger. Very cinematic. Once they got into Conemaugh, the flood's still coming. They weren't totally out of the way the stories make it sound, but for the most part they were. And the whistle blowing did give some of the town warning because a whistle nonstop blowing from the train is one of those, it's almost like a tornado siren. It means something is very, very wrong. And this was one of the few towns that had good warning because of that whistle of the train escaping. And a number of people were able to get out of the way of the flood because they heard that whistle and were able to leave. Day Express was also in the depot at East Conemaugh. The train had moved twice at this point to try and get out of the way of the floodwaters, but the passengers hadn't been evacuated, and neither had passengers from a nearby mail train. They had moved as far away from the river as they could at this point, and when train number 2 came blasting into the station with the floodwaters behind them. When that train pulled in, men got off screaming and hooting and hollering about the flood coming, telling folks to get up and get out of the way. One of the trains had been telling folks what had been going on and that we might have to evacuate, but the other one hadn't told anyone anything. So the first train where folks kind of knew that there might be a dam break, people got off real quick and got out really fast. But on the train where people had no warning, they went slower.
Yeah.
They didn't know. They stopped to try and get their shoes. They stopped to try and get their bags. They didn't run. So there were far more people that survived on the Day Express than did on the mail train because they knew to get off and get out of the way. In order for these people to get to the safety of the next hill, the train passengers had to leap this relatively deep ditch that was already roaring with water. The scene was completely chaotic, filled with both moments of heroism as men tossed women and children over the ditch and tragedy when folks fell in. Both of those trains were completely wiped out with the flood, along with most of East Conemaugh. So this is now, we've got train engines and freight cars in these floodwaters, going through all of this. In a town...
with some houses, too.
With lots of houses, and bodies and cows and dead horses and trees and pieces of a viaduct. And it's... Every moment this flood goes further, there's more shit in it to wipe you out. It gets more dangerous. It's bonkers. In a town not far from the depot, the streets were full of running and screaming people. And as they ran, houses were being picked up and smashed or floating away behind them. Number of the railroad cars broke off trains when the station was hit and were easy to spot floating in the debris, some with passengers still inside of them, like that mail car. Because
that sucks.
Whoosh, with people still in them. In town, once again, the destruction of all low-lying areas was pretty much complete and total. The town's 2 multi-story hotels were swept away, the post office, the rail station, most of the stores, over half the town. 30 locomotives, so not just the freight cars, but the steam engines, were swept away from the train depot.
Was the wall of water still 70 feet tall at this point?
I think in this part of town, it was closer to 50 or 60 feet because how tall the water is based on how narrow the valley is.
Right.
And at this point, it was a little bit lower than 70 feet, but still quite tall. I don't believe it ever goes below 40 feet.
None of their buildings were that tall.
Some of them were. Some of them were 5 to 6 story hotels, especially as we get lower into the valley. And more of these, because the valley itself, you've got the Cambria Ironworks and the real industry, and it's spreading up the valley. So the valley gets less and less crowded towards the top. But as the flood comes down, there's more and more people. It's more and more crowded. There's more and more hotels because just they're being built up. They're boomtowns. So yes, there were buildings that were taller than the floodwaters. And in this case, some of those hotels probably would have been taller. I'm not totally sure how tall it was in East Conemaugh, but it didn't go below 40 feet. I know that. And I believe East Conemaugh was one of the narrower ones, so I would say 50 to 60, but don't quote me on that for sure. In East Conemaugh and Franklin, which was, remember I said there's a lot of politics? Franklin is basically East Conemaugh, but it had its own special name for that area of houses. Yeah. The known death toll came to a total of 28. Okay. So not as bad as it could have been, but we're getting more and more deaths as these go through town. We went from 4, 16, now we're at 28. One section of train and 6 cars miraculously made it through the flood, even though they had been in the floodwaters. Somehow, despite the flood rolling over them and past them, the train wasn't completely picked up, and though debris was smashed all around it, all of the passengers that had been too afraid to leave the cars were alive and okay. Just something about how the debris hit it. It didn't get swept off, so the water went through it and they survived. It's nuts. Nuts to me and worth mentioning because there's a lot of little moments. So
was there water flowing over them for 40 minutes? You said it took about 40 minutes for that.
So the train station is off to the side, so it wasn't flowing over them for 40 minutes. Okay. But it did flow through the train car. Okay. Not 40 minutes. Still, the wave continued on. It had not reached Johnstown yet, the namesake of the flood, and it still had much more valley to cover. An additional 700 freight cars, 30-plus locomotives, houses, farms, dead animals, and dead humans were barreling through the valley at this point. Up until now, the valley had had a number of switchback-like turns and large hills in the middle that would split and slosh the raging waters, slowing them down. Some, with the exception of the bridge dam, had stopped and then set the river off wildly. From East Conemaugh to Johnstown, though, the valley opened up and was a straight shot, so the flood picked up quite a bit of speed with all of this new debris in it.
So, more momentum.
More shit.
More potential, more damaging.
It's me. It's going to be bad.
It's going to be bad.
Woodvale was the next town between there and Johnstown. It was a bit bigger than East Conemaugh, new and also run by the Cambria Iron Company with a population of about 1,000. Unlike East Conemaugh, though, Woodvale got absolutely no warning. The entire town and flood was done in about 5 minutes there. At the western end of town, the part that almost touched Johnstown, stood the Gaudier Works, another steelmaker. When the wave hit this, it set a giant geyser of steam into the air and set off a giant fire. When the water hit its boilers, the whole thing seemed to lift up and slide off with the water in the explosion. The tannery went, a streetcar shed, at least 89 horses, and 30 tons of hay, too. When the flood was done, the town was nothing more than a mud flat strewn with bits of wreckage here and there. Only a few houses that were along the foothills still stood, and there was absolutely no evidence that a railroad had ever existed here. 250 homes were just gone, and there was no way to even tell where they had been in the first place. The official figure for Woodvale deaths is 314, which means 1 out of 3 people living in this town had been killed by the flood.
Jesus.
A number of people had tried to crawl under a freight train in Woodvale that had blocked their way, and they were crushed under it when it moved. Many more were swept away in their homes. When the wireworks broke up, it added miles upon miles of barbed wire to the sludge mountain.
Jesus, what the fuck?
Racing through the valley.
So there's just fucking barbed wire
just tons
strewn throughout this wall of water.
Yep.
This is more than just death incarnate.
Sorry. I was reading about this, and every page I was going, what the
ribbons.
It's a banana story. Yeah. Because the wireworks their whole job was to make barbed wire. An entire, basically, barbed wire factory gets swept away, and all of it is sent into the flood.
But you hear about floods, and sometimes when you see these floods, you see the houses going by. Like, in those moments, you think about it. I've seen floods with cows in them.
I know, right?
The poor cows just kind of swimming, trying to stay afloat. But you don't necessarily think about all of the debris that is in there. Like, you'll see the trees sticking out.
Boys and girls, this is why they tell you not to go in floodwater. Oh. It's not good.
No.
Floodwater is very, very bad. Please don't touch floodwater. Please don't let your kids play in floodwater. Well, floodwater is not good.
and it's also not sanitary because
That too.
all the dead things in it, all the and now the sewage, all.
Now nowadays the likelihood of a barbed wire factory being in the flood is probably less, but in this case there was a barbed wire factory sending miles and miles into the flood.
I got to tell you real quick that there was. I have an image in my head. There's a couple of them from a few floods that I've seen, but one in a mountain valley that I worked in.
I remember you telling me about this
before we got together. Yeah, I wasn't there when this happened, but there was one of the locals who lived there had videotaped it, and so it showed us. And this was like a couple of years before I actually went to work there. This is a valley near Big Bear in California, and there was. I forget why it flooded, but there was a flood. It was just a wall of water, just like cruising down the valley.
I remember you telling me about that. And again, I haven't seen the video, but usually with flash floods like this, it does look like a wall because of that, the bottom part going slower.
Yeah, it's wild because it's like almost this vertical wall of water. It's not like this slant like you would imagine.
Yeah, it's not like the tide coming in.
No.
It is far more like a tsunami with these flash floods. And with a dam breaking, it's even more dramatic because a flash flood is usually quite dramatic. And that's, I'm assuming, what happened in that one. It was a flash flood in California. And California does, particularly in areas like that, have quite a few flash floods. When you see flash flood warnings in areas, that's the kind of stuff you want to look out for. Because like the valley at this point, those areas just straight up don't have the plants to kind of keep everything in place. So when it rains a lot, it just flows down and floods very, very quickly.
Yeah, and this flood that I'm talking about, it didn't really do a ton of damage to any of the houses. It damaged maybe one of the two of the bridges a little bit, but for the most part, the river, the creek/river that ran through the bottom of the valley had a pretty wide channel.
We're also a little smarter now about where we build places because we do understand flash flooding a bit more than we did, in the late 1800s.
Yeah.
Because the late 1800s, we're still kind of deep in figuring out that we can't just control the world through technology. The Johnstown Flood, the Titanic, these different disasters, really the 1900 Galveston hurricane, these all very much contributed to the change in like the American and European understanding of the world, thinking that we could just forcibly control it. And this is one of those, like,
if we build better,
really life-changing or culturally changing events that change the mindset from we can brute force with our railroads and our technology, bend the world to our will, and realizing we can't. And that's been an interesting step. And with that comes, when we talk about places that are built now, we generally don't build in canyons that have flash flooding issues because there's not much you can do to stop a flash flood. Now, I would argue that there's still things that we try to control more than we should.
Oh, sure.
The number one thing that always comes to my head is wildfires. We still think we can control wildfires far more than we actually can.
Yeah. We see the evidence to the contrary just about every year.
Yeah. At any rate, Johnstown. It was now almost an hour since the dam had given way, 14 miles upstream. The rain had started to let up some, though it was still coming down, and in Johnstown, the water in the streets actually appeared to be going down some at this point, and many in Johnstown thought that the worst had passed.
They were wrong.
The time was roughly 4:07, and the flood was now inside of Johnstown, the most populous city in the area, and almost no one knew what was happening. Because of the speed it had built up and the debris that it had gathered, it struck Johnstown the hardest of any town thus far on its 14-mile journey.
A fucking battering ram.
The drowning...
with barbed wire.
Very much. The drowning of Johnstown only took about 10 minutes, but they were an absolutely brutal 10 minutes. Countless desperate moments of people grabbing for children and running, leaping from homes, riding roofs and mattresses, absolute mad scramble and dash for survival as their homes, businesses, churches, and town were crushed around them. Most people in Johnstown never saw the water coming. They only heard it. It began as a deep, steady rumble and then grew louder until it became a cacophony of sound, roaring like thunder or like continuous dynamite explosions, like the rush of an oncoming train. One survivor said, "I will never forget the sound of that. It sounded to me like a lot of horses grinding oats." And that description is half funny, but also, like, can you imagine the sound of horses grinding oats at that volume? How terrifying that would be? Ugh. Ear-splitting screams and crashes as buildings went down, glass shattered, house sidings ripped apart, and many swore church bells were ringing the entire time. Those who actually saw the wall of water at this point say it didn't even look like water at first. It looked more like a dust storm followed by a wall of debris where you couldn't even see the water through it. It was also preceded by a very strong rush of air that hit before the wave itself did and knocked down some of the more flimsy homes.
Damn.
Exactly like we talked about in Frank's slide.
Yeah.
Which makes sense when you're displacing that
much air. I totally
forgot
about that.
Yep. I didn't realize it could happen with floods, but it can, which is interesting to me.
That's wild.
The wave itself snapped off trees and crushed houses like eggshells. Many described it as a death mist approaching. Up the river, where there had been an explosion where the Gaudier Works was hit and then waters rolled over more fires, accounted for a lot of the actual smoke and smog that were preceding the flood at this point because it had, blown a bunch of shit up and it was now pushing that in front of it as it flowed into the town.
Are parts of the floodwaters on fire?
Not yet.
No, not yet. Okay. I will wait.
I mean, maybe some of it are, but not.
You talked about that steam plant and something blowing up.
I'm thinking there might be some of it that's on fire at this point, but not. We're going to get to the fire. We're not at the fire yet. As the water rushed through town, crushing everything in its path, about 4 minutes in, much of it hit a large hill in the middle of town, one that rose about 550 feet tall near Stony Creek. Once the wave hit that, it created another massive back wave, sending much of the debris back over the town, crushing and drowning much that hadn't already been crushed or drowned in the initial wave, and creating eddies and whirlpools throughout the entire town of Johnstown.
So if you're floating, you're getting drug under.
Pretty much. There was lots of little back and forth waves that were happening thanks to other hills. And instead of just sweeping through like it did at Woodvale or East Conemaugh or Mineral Point or any of these other towns, the water sloshed back and forth over areas multiple times in a row, almost like a toddler had gotten into the bathtub and started splashing the water around. It was not a swift run-through like it was in the other towns. There were houses and rooftops floating, though, some with 30 to 40 people clinging on top, being sent spinning every which way in the current. Some would drift for hours, but most would end up piling against the large stone bridge at the end of Johnstown, where the majority of debris were starting to end up at this point. Because of these hills in Johnstown, the bridge was never hit with the full force of the water, thanks to that geography. Instead, it was hit with smaller waves, and the debris was able to pile up, being held into the arches. Unlike higher up in the valley now, the debris was things like train cars, locomotives, entire homes, factory roofs, masses of barbed wire, dead horses, dead cows, dead humans, living horses, cows, humans, and other creatures. It was eventually built so much that it was taller than the bridge itself and became near watertight so that no more water could eke through it, again creating just stagnant water and a dam in Johnstown. This would have been bad enough, but very quickly the debris caught fire at the bridge, meaning all of the people that were being swept away but still clinging to life on various pieces of debris were being swept into a giant flaming pile of debris.
That's even
horrifying.
More horrifying.
Horrifying. No one knows for sure what caused the fire, whether it was from coal that had been tossed out of stoves, dumped all over homes, oil from a tank car that had been swept away in the flood, or any number of other causes. But the fact was it caught fire and it stayed on fire for hours with folks trapped inside. By 10 o'clock that evening, the light from the fire was bright enough that you could read a newspaper anywhere in town.
So it's still holding the water back on fire.
And on fire.
It's awful.
It's not good. George Heiser owned a shop on the main drag of town, and his family lived above it. That day, he had closed down the shop early and retreated upstairs to escape the floodwaters and wait out the storm. Floods had never reached this far up in town before, but today it was starting to fill the shop up. Around 4, George sent his son Victor to the barn to check on the horses. The animals had been tied in their stalls, and George wanted them untied so they wouldn't strangle themselves as the water got higher. Victor was on his way back to the house when he heard the noise of the flood coming at him, and when he looked at his home, he saw his father, George, motioning at him to go back to the barn and to climb the stairs. The boy was up onto the roof in seconds, and when he looked out over the town, he could see the wave of devastation bearing down through the town. He couldn't see water yet, just a wall of rubbish wiping everything out in its path. Roofs, huge roots of plants, planks, train cars, etc. When it hit his street, he watched as his home with his family inside be crushed and swallowed up, and the barn he was on top of was ripped from its footings and started to roll like a barrel over and over and over again. Running, stumbling, crawling, hand over hand, clawing at the tin and wood, Victor somehow managed to stay on top. As he did this, he saw the neighbor's house in front of him with the barn going right at it and their neighbor, Mrs. Fenn, looking out. When the barn hit the house, he jumped from the barn roof to his neighbor's roof just as the walls gave in and the roof plunged downward. He clambered as best he could up, being deafened by the noise, and still he saw no water, but the air was filled with flying boards, glass, and felt more like being in an explosion than in a flood. With the house rolling beneath him, he managed to grab hold of yet another house by the eaves and hung on there, dangling for a moment, trying to gain purchase, before he was tossed off and slammed down onto another piece of roof from the barn. This was the first time he actually saw water, and he was now riding on, clinging to the roof as it continued to smash across Johnstown. He saw the entire Musanti family sailing by on what looked like a barn before a massive wreckage heaved up and crushed them. He was heading toward a mound of debris that had collected against the stone Methodist church that was somehow still standing. When he hit that, he again went leaping and jumping across debris that was shifting under his feet until a freight car loomed up above him, looking for all the world like it was going to land directly on top of him. God. The brick building he was on top of, beneath him, broke apart and shot him out like a gun, so the freight train landed right behind him, and he was on a roof now in comparatively open water, moving quickly, though there seemed to be far less danger here than there was amongst the debris at the beginning. There were people struggling and dying all around him. God. Mrs. Fenn, his neighbor that he saw when he crashed into her house, went by bouncing on a tar barrel, doused in all of its contents, trying to hold on. There was a naked man praying on a roof. He went like this for a minute, just enough to catch his breath before being caught in a back current. The current took him near the edge of the valley and near a 2-story brick building that seemed to just barely be staying put, and he was able to jump off of his raft onto the roof to join a small group of people already taking refuge there.
That's fucking nuts.
Fucking nuts. Agnes Chapman, I have a lot of stories because the stories in this one blew my fucking mind. Agnes Chapman watched her husband go pale when he looked out the window around 4 p.m. that day. Her husband, one of the town's reverends, had just seen a boxcar with a man standing on top of it roll down the pavement in front of the tiny parsonage that they were taking refuge from the floods in. This was because in front of the main mass of the flood, there was faster moving eddies that were taking other pieces of debris. So literally he saw just a train with a dude riding on top of it roll by down on the street very, very quickly. As he passed by the house, the man clinging to the top of it grabbed onto a tree in the yard, swung onto the roof, and then climbed into their 2nd-story window right above where the Reverend had been watching this go on. Huh. The man who had been riding the train was a ticket agent from the rail station that had been wiped out further upstream. Those trains I told you about in East Conemaugh, he rode that train all the way down from East Conemaugh.
Holy shit.
Until he was able to jump into the Reverend's house. The Reverend knew when he saw that this must mean the reservoir had broken, and he yelled at everyone to get up into the attic. They barely made it up the stairs before the floodwaters rushed into their home. They heard more than saw the porch get swept away and could hear as other buildings and debris rubbed and grinded up against their home. Another man came bounding through the window as they waited, thinking the house would be swept away at any minute, and the man immediately got down on his knees and started praying. Despite everything, the parsonage ended up being able to hold on, and when the roar died down, Chapman went out to see what he could see, which was a scene of utter desolation. Only a few buildings, including the Methodist church, were sticking up out of the water. He didn't know, but the church had created a lay-safe area, taking the brunt of the water, and protected some of the buildings behind it. And this happened. Johnstown had more buildings that survived than any of the other towns, because of those hills that were in the area. With the water sloshing around, there were some areas that were just hit slightly less. And it's almost like a tornado when you look at what survived, because it doesn't make a ton of sense. Some things got lucky. And in the rest of the valley, while they were able to get out faster and there was less deaths, there was also more complete destruction than there was Johnstown was wiped out, but there were more buildings that were left somewhat standing.
Okay.
So The Holbert House was the fanciest hotel in town. 4 stories high, made entirely of brick, it had seemed like one of the best places to ride out the storm earlier that day before the dam broke.
Right.
So it was pretty full when the flood hit, with around 60 people inside. Only 9 of those people made it out alive when it was shattered completely by the flood.
Oof.
Gertrude Quinn. This is the girl who our quote from the beginning was. Her story is fucking bonkers. She was James Quinn's 6-year-old daughter. The Quinns lived in one of the nicest private homes in town, a large 3-story red brick Queen Anne house that was newly built earlier that year. It stood well up off the street, and it was assumed to be safe even from the worst of spring flooding. Besides Gertrude, there were 6 other children in the family. Vincent, who was 16, Helen, Layla, Rosemary, Gertrude, Marie, and Tom. There was also Lily Hip, the 18-year-old nurse girl, and Gertrude's Aunt Abby and her infant son, Richard, along with 2 other children. One child, Marie, was sick with the measles when the day started, so James told everyone to stay inside when he went to their store to move everything to higher ground, with Vincent, the oldest child. In her later years, Gertrude said that her father was worried enough about the flooding that she was sure he would have moved them all to the hills sooner if it hadn't been for Marie and the measles. He was worried about bringing her outside because light can fuck up your eyes when you have the measles. He wanted to keep Marie inside. At any rate, though, after lunch, Gertrude defied her father and went out back on the back porch to dangle her feet in the floodwaters and watch the ducks as they moved by slowly.
Don't do this, children.
Her father, James, appeared behind her, scooped her up, and brought her inside for a lecture on listening when the dark mist appeared and the noise began. Instead of a lecture, he shouted, "Run for your lives, follow me straight for the hills." Someone screamed to him about the baby. He leapt up the stairs to grab Marie, and they took off, telling everyone to follow him and not go back for anything. Everyone but Vincent set out behind him, Helen and Rosemary on either side as he carried the baby. But Aunt Abby, Libby, and who had Gertrude in her arms, turned back because Aunt Abby didn't want to get her feet wet in the dirty water, and Libby had followed her with Gertrude. Gertrude had kicked, screamed, and bit at Libby to try and go with her father, but it was no use. James, upon reaching the hill, realized that some of his family wasn't behind him, handed off Marie to try and go back for them, but it was too late. He looked back and saw his house begin to rock back and forth, lurch sideways, and then topple over and disappear. Gertrude never saw the wave. Libby and Aunt Abby had pulled her and the other child they had with them into a cupboard. They felt the house give a violent shudder, and then the walls started to break up before a giant gush of water protruded under their feet up through the floor, breaking apart the floorboards. Gertrude did what she could to stay afloat, grabbing whatever she could and kicking as hard as she could, managing eventually to climb out through a hole in the wall or the roof, she wasn't sure which. And she had no idea what happened to her aunt, Libby, or her baby cousin. She managed to climb onto a mattress and started screaming for help. A dead horse slammed into her raft, nearly knocking her off, but as they went by a tree, the horse got caught up in its branches. Not her, thankfully, and as she went by it, she saw the horse bobbing up and down, almost like the most gruesome rocking horse you can imagine in your life. Weak and shuddering, she laid down, realizing that most of her clothing had been torn off. A small white house went sailing by, almost running her over. She called out to the man who was riding on top of it, hugging the chimney with both arms, and he didn't answer, either because he didn't hear her or ignoring her. After that, a long roof loaded with 20-some-odd people steamed by, and she started screaming out for them. One man got up to jump in to save her, and he had to fight the others who tried to stop him from getting off the roof, but he eventually made it into the water, swam over to her mattress, and pulled her up into his arms. Shortly after he got to her mattress, the long roof he had been on hit a whirlpool and dumped and drowned most of its passengers.
Jesus Christ.
The man's name was Maxwell McArchin. On a hillside to the right, as they traveled down, there were 2 men leaning out of a window of a small white building using poles to try and rescue those who were trapped in the flood. They tried to reach the raft that Maxwell and Gertrude were on, but couldn't. They called out to Maxwell, telling him to throw the baby over to them. He shouted back, asking if they could catch her, and they said they could try. So he tried. He threw her. Gertrude sailed 10 to 15 feet across the water and landed into the arms of Henry Cook, who quickly wrapped her up in a blanket and put her on a cot. Later, she was picked up and carried to the hill, so bundled up in her warm blanket that she couldn't see out and no one could see her. She was eventually deposited at the Metz family house, who got her dressed in some warm flannels and by the fire, but she was too terrified to say anything, so they weren't able to help her find her family right away. Folks would drop in to look at her to try
arms to throw her like that.
Bananas.
Good guy, though. Damn.
And he survives. We're going to get to how he survives, which is a super cool story, too. But he does make it. But yeah, folks would come in to try and, like, identify her because she couldn't talk. She was too scared. So people were coming in to try and figure out who this little girl was. That's some serious
fucking trauma.
And she's 6.
Yeah.
6 years old. Such a baby.
That's some therapy bills.
Right?
Look.
Reverend Dr. David Beale, pastor of the Presbyterian Church on Main Street, was one of several hundred people crowded into the pitch-dark rooms of the second, third, and fourth stories of Alma Hall, part of some of the church buildings. He and his family had been at home when the flood hit a few feet away from the hall. As they climbed up the stories to their attic, trying to escape, a man who had been in the flood got swept through their third-story window. The man was from Woodvale. The next town up. He had been floating in the flood, and he got swept in through their window. The house miraculously managed to stay together for a while. Again, also in the shadow of the Methodist Church.
Yeah.
But it started to give way after really, like, I think it was 30, 45 minutes. It was after the worst of the flood, but it was starting to give way. So a decision was made among the family and the man who got swept in the fucking window to try and cross over the debris to Alma Hall to take refuge there, since that building was holding up better. Reverend Beale, his family, and their new friend from Woodville carefully used a rope to cross the top of the debris into the third story of Alma Hall. You're fucking besties now when someone gets swooped in through your window.
It down and then, like, randomly into a window. Like, lucky guy.
Very much. And if you're a reverend and somebody literally gets tossed in your window, that's your new bestie.
Oh, yeah.
God said, this is your follower. Take him.
You shall be friends. I have spoken.
This is yours. No take-backs.
Yeah. He lives with you now.
James Walters had another absolutely miraculous journey that day. He had been swept from his home on Walnut Street onto a roof, which took him spinning across town until he smashed into the side of Alma Hall, where he flew headfirst in a window, landing squarely in his own office.
You need to go to work now.
Jesus was like, you have business. You have fucking business, guy. At some point.
To his own office.
Now, Alma Hall was one of the, administration buildings for the Presbyterian Church.
Okay.
The Methodist Church is the one that was blocking the floodwaters and keeping these buildings safe. Just for this next part, I feel like that's important. At some point,
we had some spiritual rivalry coming up.
At some point, someone in Alma Hall reverently said that the Methodist Church had saved them, only to be shouted down by somebody else saying that only the Catholic Church could save. It's the end fucking times. People are literally being tossed in windows. Because, I mean, I'm not even religious, but I'm looking at this going like, maybe I'm a little stitious. Because I feel like Jesus was plucking people out and literally tossing them in goddamn windows at this point. Like, this one, mine. Here, mine. Because that's, what else is that? What else could that be? But no, it's only the Catholics, which, I mean, I was raised Catholic, so yes.
Oh, dear Lord.
So, around nightfall now, the city looked like a giant, disgusting lake. There were little fires around much of the debris, the giant fire at the bridge, and water 20 to 30 feet tall all throughout town. Just as the sun started to set, a break occurred at the bridge. Not the entire thing, but just enough water for debris to kind of file out like a spillway, rushing through there, draining the water in town slowly and sweeping some people and debris out into the rest of the valley. It wasn't enough to cause damage to the rest of the valley, but it was enough to start actually draining Johnstown, thankfully. Some people were drowned or crushed in this spillway, but one of the survivors was our pal, Maxwell McArchin, who was, after throwing little Gertrude safely, sailed on towards the bridge, was sucked through the break, and rode the mattress all the way down to Cambria City, past the Cambria Works, which were destroyed, and another 4 miles down the Conemaugh River before being pulled out of the river by some men with ropes. 4 miles on that little mattress.
Damn.
Yep. The water in the city was going down, but slowly. Lots of water was still flowing into the city from upriver because it was still raining after all. There were more buildings standing in Johnstown than the towns before it. but they were standing in 20 to 30 feet of water with folks huddled inside. For many, this was absolutely the worst part of the ideal. Waiting all night for the waters to go down enough to fully escape, not knowing exactly what else might happen. It was dark. It was horrible. And in a strange twist of fate, the bells in the Methodist church, that was the town's clock, the mechanism that ran them, wasn't destroyed, so the bells were still going every hour, marking time throughout the entirety of the night. Around 8 o'clock at night, the Catholic church in town caught fire before the whole building collapsed in on itself. So it survived the majority of the flood to catch fire and then collapse. The only light available to the survivors would have been the flames from the bridge and other buildings in town. Most survivors reported being unwilling to light a match or anything for fear of what could happen with natural gases or other just gunk that was in the water.
Yeah.
Everyone was sopping wet. Many people were injured. It was miserable. There was no food. There was no safe water. There were no blankets. There were no dry clothes. There was no medical supplies. Outside of the buildings, there were occasional screams, crying, fire, moaning could be heard alongside the sound of unearthly howling of dogs and other animals. And there was no assurance that the buildings that they were in wouldn't go at some point as well, because many of them did crack apart and fall apart with their occupants inside of them. Folks moved as little as possible, trying their best not to disturb anything. The buildings did cave in throughout the night. The biggest example is obviously the Catholic Church, and that was the most dramatic, but the Keystone Hotel also caught fire, along with several other smaller ones. Along with these big groups of survivors, like in the Alma, there were other countless groups of 2, 3, 4, 5 huddling to whatever they could. One family had jumped onto a large bed, which had floated out through their roof, and they had all managed to stay on it throughout the entire night. Another family named Williams had their house split in half at the bridge when it struck that pile of debris, then went floating up the Stony Creek in what was left of the attic. In the darkness that night, Mrs. Williams gave birth to a baby boy.
What?
Yep.
I mean, when it's time, it's time.
Not much you can
holy
do. If anyone wants to tell me your birth horror story, I'm just going to remind you of Mrs. Williams. Mrs.
It wasn't as bad as that.
Right? Mrs. Jacob Maisie hung onto the eaves of her house all night up to her waist in water. Miss Minnie Chambers had climbed inside of a freight car, which had been carried through the break at the bridge and smashed apart at the Cambria Works, where she, miraculously still alive, held onto a pipe on the roof all night. Several people spent the night in trees, never daring to close their eyes lest they fall into the dark current.
Fuck.
Of those that made it to the hillside, many were in such a state of shock they just started walking the hell away from there, not stopping until the next day when they reached another town. The greatest horror of all, though, really by far, was the fire at the bridge and the screaming as folks burned alive. Each crash of debris would bring a moment of silence, and then the screams would start up again. Folks were trying their best to get people out almost from the moment the debris piled up, but it was difficult at best. They did not have axes. They did not have tools. They did not have anything but their bare hands. They were trying to get people out of this flaming mass. Frank McDonald, a railroad conductor from East Conemaugh, who had been, just kind of whooshed into town, said, "They reminded me a lot of flies on flypaper, struggling to get away with no hope and no chance to save them."
Oh, that's haunting.
Yeah. Now, while certainly to those who were watching, it appeared that there were thousands of folks getting caught up in the debris pile, but the reality is probably closer to 500 to 600 people were caught at the bridge, and a total of around 80 to 90 deaths happened there. So it's quite a few, but it's not the thousands that it probably felt like to the people that were watching that night. The fire burned all through the night and was still going when morning came. In towns all downriver, folks could see the sheen and smoke from the heat.
Wow.
With all of the telegraph wires down and it being up in the mountains, it took longer than one would hope, both for news of the catastrophe to reach people who could help and for help to reach the towns that had been devastated. It didn't help.
I'm sure there were little to no roads to get there.
The roads, too, but also it's not like they could just call down. People were getting swept up and news was starting to spread, but not as quickly as you would hope. And there definitely was not a lot of availability for rescue workers, for supplies, for things to make it back up. It was not a good situation. People were kind of on their own. It also didn't help that the idea of the dam breaking was boy who cried wolf in the towns below as well. Believing that it broke and it had caused such devastation was difficult for a lot of people to buy in those initial hours where people were trying to figure out what
he must be exaggerating.
Mm-hmm. So Pitt Carn was one of the railway managers in the area, and he was already planning on taking a train up into the valley on May 31st to check out some of the damage and try and figure out what they could do to get the rail lines back up and running. It didn't take long for him to realize once he got deeper into the mountains that this was a whole lot bigger than just some railway stops being washed out. They were a few miles south of Johnstown when they started seeing debris in the water around 4:30 that day when they were looking for these breaks in the rail line. And that combined with not being able to get or receive telegrams from the town or anywhere further north of Johnstown was enough to know that something truly bad had happened. They had stopped the train shortly after finding debris when they started seeing people emerge floating down the river. First, there was a man hanging onto telegraph poles. There were people holding onto driftwood being swept along by the current. Pitt Carn and the others, to their credit, tried to save anyone that they could, but the river carried most of them out of sight before they could do anything. They returned to the closest telegraph station they could to send word to Pittsburgh that there had been a disaster, and more folks started to appear drifting down the waterway as they did that. They counted a total of 119 people going by, dead and alive, but they were only able to rescue 7 of them.
Wow.
They went back to the town of New Florence at this point, sending out more messages, calling for folks to try and make their way up here as soon as possible, and then tried to wait through the night till morning, hoping they'd be able to do more then. As people were plucked out of the water, more and more detailed messages went to Pittsburgh and then out to the world at large as the press got wind of what was going on here. Newspapers, getting hold of the story, started sending out memos to each other and trying to figure out what they were going to put in those morning papers. One of those internal memos, just to illustrate how boy cries wolf it was, read, "A rumor loaded with horror holds this city in dreadful expectancy tonight. It is said that the bursting of a reservoir just above Johnstown, a flourishing place in the Cambria County, has flooded the town and swept at least 200 citizens to their death. The news is of a very uncertain character, there being no communication with the district where the flood is reported to have occurred, all the wires being down. There is no way to get to the scene of the disaster, and full particulars are not expected tonight." Usually what you hear about newspapers at the time, it's like...
sensational.
And 200 deaths was their sensational at that point. And we're going to get to how many deaths there were, but it's a lot more than 200.
Yeah, I imagine so.
That said, the rush to Johnstown had already begun. They weren't going to make it very quickly.
No.
But they were trying. 2 trains had been chartered by 5 different Pittsburgh newspapers and had left Pittsburgh by 7 p.m. on the 31st. The closest they could get by train was a town called Bolivar, which was 20 miles south of Johnstown. Many pushed on foot to New Florence that night, where Pitt Carn was with his men, which they reached around 1 a.m. The stories they heard there led them to believe that it was definitely not just a rumor and that thousands had been killed that day. Much of the information they got sucked.
Yeah.
But key facts, like the South Fork Dam broke and that Johnstown was devastated, were there in the early stories. Some of the journalists took off into the night to try and make it on foot to Johnstown by morning, just hiking through the mountains to get there as fast as they could.
Interesting.
I mean, get there as fast as you can. And photos were a thing. There's plenty of photos of this disaster. And a lot of photographers went to Johnstown to take as many pictures as they could. And yellow journalism is still very much a thing at this point. So getting the most sensational story, very much a thing. So I don't think it's that surprising that they took off on foot to be the first ones there. But
and the first one, you to get the scoop first. Yeah.
The rain had blissfully stopped by the morning of June 1st, but it was still hazy and pretty gross out. Thousands upon thousands of people huddled on the hillsides of Johnstown, wet, starving, and traumatized. There weren't nearly enough structures to house them, and so they were just waiting in the elements, hoping that somebody would come and help and that they could figure something out. People started to pour out from within the drowned city as well that morning for the hillside rather than stay in the building places they had taken shelter in, with the sun up and the waters receding quite far.
Yeah.
Rescue parties from those who had survived started to get to work, bringing folks down from roofs and trees and out of the wreckage, scrambling through the debris to see if they could find anyone alive. And at the bridge, rescue efforts were hampered by the lack of tools, but they were still going and doing what they could. Again, they only had their bare hands to work with. There was no axes. There was no hammers. There was nothing to help them break it apart. It's still on fire. But they're still trying. They're doing whatever they can. The problems were obviously immediate and enormous. Food and shelter were of paramount importance, but disease was also going to be a large issue too, with that many dead things spread throughout and wet, decomposing very quickly. There were many injured as well. Gertrude's grandmother, the little girl who got tossed, just for example, she had her scalp torn from her forehead to the nape of her neck. And that's just one example of a number of, this is debris ripping people apart. It's not good. Dozens were already also in the early stages of pneumonia because there was no dry clothes. There was no way to get dry. They were already starting to get sick from everything that was going on.
Yeah.
All the roads were washed out. Bridges were impassable. Telegraph lines were down. Large-scale help was going to take a while to get there, but in the meantime, those who hadn't lost their homes opened up their food supplies and helped out as much as they could. People looked after lost children and did really whatever they could to try and relieve some of the pressure that was going on, and they pulled together.
What else can you do?
Yeah, right?
God.
The press did start to arrive in town on June 1st, having walked all the way from New Florence. And while they tried to help, folks in the valley were still very much on their own. Help was on the way, but it took a minute. The folks of Johnstown held a meeting and elected what they called a dictator to help organize their effort. They elected Arthur J. Moxham. He organized the citizen committees. He established morgues, but with no paper and pens, it was difficult to keep track of what bodies were there, who they were. But they did what they could to help clean them off and organize, and started having folks try and remove particularly anything dead to try and help with the disease aspect of everything. Temporary hospitals were established. A police force was established. They tried to gather and ration what supplies were available, really just tried to pull everyone together, and did a fairly decent job until the bigger scale help could arrive. On the note of the morgues, it would take over a week for these efforts to be fully organized and fully useful. The final death toll for the disaster came in at 2,209 people. That is the accepted death toll. And again, as usual with a disaster this old, it's likely larger. Yeah. But that is the accepted death toll of people who died just in the flood portion on their own.
And that's not counting the disease after or...
That's just people who died on like May 31st from the flood. Of course, there were hundreds who were lost and would never be found, and a third of the bodies were never identified at all. There were 663 bodies that were buried as unknown victims. A few were not identifiable because they'd been decapitated.
Ooh.
There were close to 100 who had been burned so badly that they were beyond recognition, even down to what sex they were. Wow. Many of the bodies included in this death count weren't found until late June or even July, August, and even
you said
some of them
like been slammed and buried into the mud. And
it was hard to find all of these bodies. They were all over the place. There were 99 entire families that had been wiped out, 396 children under the age of 10 that had been killed, 98 children lost both parents, 124 women were left widows, 198 men lost their wives. At Morgue A, the Adams Street Schoolhouse, 301 bodies were recorded in the logbooks. Morgue B had 92. Morgue C had 551 by the time the last entry was made on December 3rd. December 3rd, 6 months after the disaster. In the valley at large, the flood killed 1 out of every 10 people. In Johnstown, it killed 1 out of every 9.
Jesus.
Bodies were being found all summer and into the fall. It wasn't uncommon to find 10 to 15 a day in July and August even. On the Saturday of the disaster, only 300 to 400 were recovered. On the Sunday after the disaster, only 300 to 400 were recovered, and very few of those were buried right away. Help did begin to arrive within the next couple of days between some ingenious boat shuttling, pulling just barges up these flooded rivers to get supplies in, and just some other creative uses. They were able to start getting people and supplies in within a couple of days. It took some time, but it wasn't months, thankfully. And help really did pour in. With the newspaper fascination, there was a ton of people donating and a ton of people wanting to help. The National Guard was eventually called in as well, and rebuilding and cleanup went relatively well. They had to use dynamite to clear the debris at the bridge. It was so densely packed that they couldn't easily get it out, so they literally had to blow it up to get things out of there. The first call for donations was by Pitcairn, one of the railroad magnates, at the Pittsburgh Old City Hall. He spoke about what he had seen when he went up there, and this was on Sunday, so the day after. He said, "Gentlemen, it is not tomorrow you want to act, but today. Thousands of lives were lost in a moment, and the living need immediate help." 2 men at the front of the hall collected by hand donations, and by the end of 50 minutes, they had $48,000.
That's more action than I expected from one of the magnates.
For sure. There's a lot of good, when it comes to like money donated to the disaster, I feel like this is one that went relatively well. We're not going to love the legal ramifications of this.
Of course.
But money wasn't a huge problem. And that's something.
Did it actually go to those who needed it?
It did.
Oh,
They did. They rebuilt the town, and it did. Everyone was helped. Well, everyone who wanted to stay was helped, and I shouldn't say everyone. The majority of people who wanted to stay. The Cambria iron mill was restarted. People got their jobs back. The town ended up being rebuilt in the same spot it was and was thriving, which is pretty, I think that's interesting. It definitely worked out well. But yeah, $48,000 in 50 minutes. That's a lot of money anytime, much less in 1889.
Yeah, all right.
Wagons were sent through the city to collect donations and came back completely laden down. The first trains that went to the area, or, close enough to the area and then were barged in, had 22 fully loaded cars of supplies, of blankets, of food, of things that people could need, just from donations in Pittsburgh alone.
Fantastic.
The Red Cross ended up making an appearance with Miss Clara Barton herself.
Tell me who she is.
She is the founder of the American Red Cross. She's a really famous lady, really, really cool. If you don't know a lot about her, highly recommend reading books or going into it. I'm going to be like, this is going to be a 3-hour episode, so I'm not going to dive into her. But she's amazing. And she was there, and this was the first major disaster that the Red Cross had dealt with in America.
Okay.
They ended up staying there for 5 months and helping quite a bit. They started with 50 doctors and nurses, and that increased over time, and they really helped the area quite a bit. There were tents brought in to house the homeless while the city was rebuilt. Disease, unfortunately, did become an issue. There was over 200 people that were diagnosed with typhoid.
Ooh.
The epidemic was kept relatively quiet, not to spread
fear,
panic and chaos. But 40 people ended up dying of typhoid by the end of summer, and of course, none of them were recorded as part of the deaths from the disaster.
Yeah.
Throughout the course of recovery, particularly in the early days, it was pretty gruesome. There were bonfires of animal carcasses and other debris burning across the valley. The smell was horrific.
Oh.
It was not a good time. It was not fun. Newspapers printed story after story about the disaster, things ranging from 10,000 deaths to things like saying all 3 of the town's blind people survived, to stories of moms found with their babes in arms, intense descriptions. At one point, there were 200 photographers in town, so photos were plentiful. This just obsession of the press led to an even bigger outpouring of sympathy, and therefore donations from either further afield than just Pittsburgh, because it became a worldwide obsession relatively quickly.
Huh.
In Pittsburgh, the donations ended up totaling $560,000.
It's a lot.
New York City, $516,000. Philadelphia, $60,000. Boston, $150,000.
Yeah.
John Philip Sousa gave a concert in their honor and donated the proceeds. Yep. Buffalo Bill did a show in Paris where the Prince of Wales attended and donated the proceedings to the victims.
Hey, go Buffalo Bill.
Right. John Jacob Astor, who died on the Titanic, donated $2,500 to the disaster.
You have all their names memorized, don't you?
Kind of do. Joseph Pulitzer.
Oh.
That guy donated $2,000. In all, the donations from within the United States came to $3.6 million. From abroad, $141,000 for a total of $3.74 million. And this does not include donated goods that flowed into the area.
That is a fuck ton of money.
When I say a ton of help came to them, I really mean it. That as far as monetary help, and that help did go to the people who needed it.
I always like when you see the good in humanity in these horrible disasters, things like that.
Now, I will say, a lot of the people who donated had more money than any person ever should have ever, but they did donate.
They helped out.
They did help out, and the town was rebuilt where it was before, and it thrived through a lot of the rest of the, late 19th and early 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
There's still towns there today that are still doing, relatively okay for steel towns in 21st century. But, they're doing all right. And it's fascinating to me and pretty interesting. And I think a lot of it did have to do with the media coverage of it, that it was fascinating to people. And this is one of those first big disasters in America that people knew about. That was widely publicized. So that has a lot to do with it. And this is also before people, like we talked about before, started to lose their twinkly eyes about technology. They still thought we could overcome, and that this was just a fluke.
Yeah, so we can build it back. We can make it stronger.
It's fine.
Make it better.
But yeah, they did all that. No. That said, it was not long after the flood that folks started to remember how many times the South Fork Hunting Club had been questioned about the dam.
Those motherfuckers.
And questions about why they had never fixed it. There is much press fascination about this as well, especially given how many hoity-toity rich and fabulous were members of the club. There were a number of attempts at lawsuits, but there were a number of defeats as well. Mm-hmm. They really didn't win anything. And most of what it came down to is the club didn't have a lot of money on its own. It just didn't.
Yeah, from your description, it seemed kind of just...
more of the servants to the rich and famous. Like, it was definitely a spot where the rich and famous loved to go. But the club itself was not incredibly rich. There was not a lot of money there. And going after the people who were at the club, it was determined by most of the courts that it wasn't their fault. Even though they were either investors or a part of the club, they were not found criminally liable.
Yeah.
There was quite a bit of public indignation at the failure, and this ended up prompting a pretty major development in American law. This was the beginnings of something called strict liability, particularly in state courts.
Okay.
And strict liability is essentially, it's a standard of liability under which someone is legally responsible for the consequences flowing from their activity, even if they didn't know that their activity would cause a problem. So it would have, if strict liability had existed when this happened, the people who owned part of the club, so like the members of the club, could have been sued, and money could have been gotten out of them, or liability could have been laid at their feet. But this didn't exist at that point. So there was a lot of just room for people to say, oh, I didn't know, or I didn't know. And Ruff, who was the one who had the dam rebuilt, was dead by the time this happened. So there was no one to really criminally go after at this point, because there was just too much plausible deniability. And now, in the world we live in today, we know a lot about all these different lawsuits and how you can sue all these different people. A lot of why that exists is because of the laws that changed because of the Johnstown disaster.
Which, fascinating.
You can make an argument either way on the good and bad of that. I think there's room for both sides of the argument.
Yeah.
But that is where that particular aspect happened.
Yeah, like I said, fascinating.
It is. The dam itself was never rebuilt, but folks today can go and see where it was, the remnants of it, along with some signs explaining what happened there. Part of the St. Michael neighborhood and most of Creslow of the town of St. Michael, Sidman, Pennsylvania, now sits on the bed of the former Lake Conemaugh.
Huh.
So it's still there, still kicking. And that is my full crazy-ass story of the Johnstown Flood.
It's so much.
It's a big one.
Yeah.
It's so interesting, though. I mean, it's horrific and sad, but...
The stories some of the survival stories are wild.
Bonkers. And Gertrude did end up finding her father and her siblings.
Oh,
Victor,
good.
He survived, but his family didn't. I don't remember if I said that or not. But he managed to survive, which I think is what his family would have wanted. He was an only child. So
it just the one boy,
Victor.
Victor, running across all these different things, just disintegrating underneath him, crashing into other things, leaping from one thing to another. Just,
I know you have
absolutely wild.
But for my girlies who read Fourth Wing, he ran the fucking gauntlet. I don't even care. I love that book. But yeah, bonkers. It's like one of those Japanese TV shows, but you can actually die.
Oh, the Wipeout?
Yeah, that one. Yep. And he made it all the way through. It's bonkers. And Gertrude's story is one of my favorites. I love that that man came out and saved her.
Swam out to her.
Maxwell, people tried to stop him, and he was like, nah, fam.
And they all died for it, apparently.
Well, not all of them, but half of them did. But yeah, a lot of them died for it. And I mean, you also, you feel like, fuck those guys, but also you can understand where they were coming from.
Yeah, like...
I can totally see don't throw yourself out there. Like,
there's no way you could survive like this raging tsunami.
Yep.
You want to go swim in it?
So,
wow.
The book I read, The Unthinkable. There's an entire chapter on heroism where she talks about how just a lot of different pieces of that. But one of the things she talks about across a lot of the book is your hypothalamus, I think it is. Hypothalamus. They did brain studies on people who have PTSD and people who did like heroic things and all that kind of stuff. And they find that the size of your hypothalamus can actually determine whether or not you act like a hero or you end up with PTSD or these different things. And it's just it's brain chemistry. Some people are just literally built that way, but also...
So you could theoretically figure out whether you would be one of those people or not?
Well, yes, but also... you're more likely, regardless of the size of your hypothalamus, to be a hero if you have training in whatever thing it is.
Oh, of course.
And the training doesn't necessarily need to be like military training or police training. It can be as simple as running through scenarios in your head over and over and over again. So people with anxiety, like me, tend to be better.
So there's a benefit.
There is an evolutionary benefit to being batshit insane and reading about disasters all the time and running through your head of what you would do. And I found that particularly interesting because for me, I read these disasters and a lot of what I like about them...
You have to put less thought into it.
Well, no, a lot of what I like about them is like, well, at least it's not that bad. Because I assume, like, if Johnstown happened, I'd try and save the babies, but I'd also die.
Yeah.
Like, I would die. And I've accepted the fact that if there was a nuclear bomb or whatever, like, I'm going to die. You're the one in the family who, like, plans for our survival and makes sure we're going to be okay. I'm like, you know what? I want to try and live if the world is going to be here after.
Yeah, we've talked about with the hypothetical, zombie apocalypse.
But a lot of times I look at it and I read disasters like this, and I do try and think about what I would try and do, and I do try and think about like how I would survive that. But a lot of times I look at it from the standpoint of like, what the fuck? I'm so glad it's not that bad.
Yeah.
But after reading The Unthinkable, I need to let my anxiety run free. Think about how I would survive it and run through these disasters. And all of you guys should apparently do that too. We should all just like...
I am highly intrigued by this book, especially from your descriptions and from the brief bit that I heard of it.
Y'all gotta read
audiobook. So
I've read it twice now.
It sounds fascinating.
I read it and then I audiobooked it because I like reading, and then if I really want to understand something, I audiobook it after I've read it.
It's now on my list.
Good. Well, we own the audiobook, so
yeah, easy to.
So that's our full story. So I feel like we should start wrapping up with like lessons learned, because it's something I like to do with myself. So my lesson learned from the Johnstown Flood is that I should do more cardio so that I can barrel run a barn. B, if someone says the dam is going to break, I should move.
Yeah.
These are my lessons. What are your lessons from the Johnstown Flood?
Don't live near a barbed wire factory and a dam combined. That seems like a hyper-specific set of circumstances, but that's horrifying.
It's a good lesson. I like it. Any other lessons?
Oh, when Dad says fucking run, don't turn back because you don't want to get your fucking feet wet.
That is also a really good lesson. That sounds like a way I would die. I'm not gonna lie.
Note to my family: if I say we're fucking going, run.
Go.
Do it.
Go. Okay, I'll find all
this. So look, I've known that if I'm gonna go in some disaster or whatever, it's gonna be because I had to go back for something. Because,
one of us did something stupid.
It's either I'm going back for one of you, in which case, like, I'm probably going to go getting you there, hopefully. Or one of the fucking cats.
It's going to be the cat.
And
Langston.
And someone's going to say, as we're like narrowly escaping, whatever, the cat or the whatever. And I'm like, shit.
You're going to be like the guy from, what was that show? This Is Us.
This Is Us.
Yep,
yeah.
That's how you're going. Don't do that. I'm not going to let you go save the cat. Sorry, cats. I hope the kids don't listen to this one. Those are our lessons.
Yeah.
Those are good lessons. I like that. Very good. So with that, I think we should probably wrap up.
Yep. Socials, right?
We have socials. We are on Threads, Blue Sky, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok. I think that's it. We're in a lot of places.
Mm-hmm.
If you have any comments, questions, or concerns about this episode, or you just want to say hi, message me.
We love it.
We do. We really, really love it. You can get a hold of us through any of the socials, or you can use our email, catastrophichroniclespod@gmail.com. I also thought it would be fun if anyone has lived through a natural disaster or any kind of disaster.
Yeah.
If you could start sending me your stories, I think it'd be fun to start including some of those on the podcast.
I would love
things that people actually had been through. Because I've had a few people reach out, but they haven't given me like full descriptions. I'm waiting for them. I hope I get some. And I would love to share some of those because I do like hearing personal stories of that kind of stuff because it's fascinating. So yeah, catastrophichroniclespod@gmail.com. Our website is www.catastrophe-chronicles.com. On there, you can find our show notes, which is where I put a brief description of the episode and all of the just tons of source material that I use. And if you want to use this as like a jumping off point for a further deep dive, you can go into some of those if you really want to like go further on a particular disaster that you enjoy. And if you want to help out the pod, we have a tip jar, which you can donate to. We would really appreciate it, but it's not necessary. And as always, please subscribe, like, and review. And with that,
stay safe, everyone.
And stay curious. We love you.